Canto 31. After crossing the bridge, Cal stopped. Who's to blame? What? Sophie responded. Is it those people back there? Or the people who made those people? Or the people who made them? There were feelings bubbling up that had started boiling when they reached the pits. Or maybe it's the person who could have been a moral compass but chose not to. Their actions don't live in a vacuum. Sophie sadly nodded. Somberly, she answered. Like, should I have been angry at the boys that raped and murdered me, or should I also be angry at the parents who raised them to become what they became? Sophie remained soft in her words. It could have been their grandparents. Then again, maybe at scout camp, one of them met the wrong type of leader and became a vengeful person instead of healed. Wiping away a tear, she concluded. Then again, maybe they had a really bad 5th grade teacher who sexually molested them, and they took revenge on me and Frank because they didn't realize who they were really angry at. It was as if Cal's fire evaporated from within, and he finally felt a real chill. Is that true? Sophie nodded. I found out after death, when I was in purgatory. It was part of my healing. She wiped away another tear, this time from the other eye. Righteous indignation could be easy if sin had only one culprit, but it goes back to when we were dust, and we will return to it when we're gone. It's older than Methuselah and reaches farther than the greatest empire. Sin hides our wounds so others will damage us further without even realizing it. Sophie took a quick breath in through her nose and a quicker breath out through her mouth. Cal looked behind him. From here, he could see all the pits as they swooped up the chasm. Was I looking at the sin or the person? Why not both? Sophie answered. The real question is, were you able to see the person apart from the sin? No. Then they belong here until that can be done. Cal turned to Sophie. But isn't that me? Not them. God, help me understand this horrible place. From the distance before them, a horn sounded. A chill ran through Cal as its sound reminded him of Stephen King's Dark Tower. Roland with his horn. Nothing terrified him, but the final book in that series did. If he looked hard, he swore he saw it. The pitch-black tower looming before them in the distance. Is that the center of hell? He asked, pointing to it. For a moment, Sophie looked shocked, then confused. Point it to me. Show me what you're seeing. It was right there, clear as day before them, even if he could only make out a general outline. Unsure of himself now, he pointed to the mass. The moment he did, a huge single laugh escaped Sophie, which was quickly followed by her piercing her lips closed. Sorry, that wasn't nice. That's not what you think it is. You can't see the final test from here. Sophie seemed to ponder Cal's apparent perplexity in his face for a moment before continuing. Let's just walk up close and you'll see what I mean. Motioning with both her hand and head, she started walking towards the mass. They were approaching a wall. It was a stone wall about 10 feet tall. It seemed getting closer was a worse option because the wall obscured their view. It was an interesting wall. The stones were inset and offset in a way that made it perfect for climbing. He touched it, remembering times he'd climbed rocky paths with his friends. Friends he no longer had. Okay, Sophie carefully began. You're not allowed to startle yourself off this wall. Cal looked incredulously at Sophie, or at least he hoped it looked incredulous after everything he'd seen already. It's just, I don't want to tell you what you saw, but you also haven't seen anything like this so far from a fallible place. This whole place is fallible, Cal countered. Fallable, she said very slowly. Fallable, because you can literally fall from it. Oh, Cal realized while looking at the wall. I'll be on top of the wall, so you don't want me to shoot back in fear or anything, because I'll fall. Right, she exclaimed, giving a strong nod. Knowing she was understood, she ordered, Let's climb. Cal again remembered the climbing he had done with his friends. Really, it was all light climbing, but it was fun to see a path over a rocky incline and have it require some foot and hand coordination. Then they both began to climb. Not to Cal's surprise, Sophie was naturally faster than he was. Other than her speed, it might have been a pleasant climb if he wasn't terrified of what he might be climbing to. Was it harpies? Maybe not. Probably not. Harpies were huge. Maybe something a bit more real. Maybe he'd see one of his friends bound, tortured, and screaming for help. That stopped his climb, almost to where his head could look over the wall. He already knew the truth. He didn't have friends. Not anymore. He pushed them away with that stupid antique store with the help of his dad and grandpa. They were to blame too. Do you need a hand? He heard from above. Cal looked up to see Sophie looking worried and already seated. I'm fine, just thinking is all. He pulled himself up to see Sophie was correct. What he was seeing wasn't a building at all, but something he never would have guessed. A giant, as tall as a skyscraper, and looking curiously at him. Well, hello, I guess. Booming in front of him, the giant responded. Past wonder, Shady Brewski's sheet had heftfart long hin. Sophie laughed, like the giant had just said something, some kind of joke, causing Cal to look at her strangely. You Nimrod, she happily yelled out. You know we can't understand you. This Nimrod then shrugged, playfully scowling. Sad oil. Hole you dolly chum-oiled. Sophie smiled, shaking her head. To Cal, she replied, These giants here are symbols of community sin. She pointed below, where the ground was a good 20 stories down at least. This scared Cal more than the giant before him. To get down there, she continued, you have to accept your part in community sin. Then one will let you down. Do you understand him? Cal asked. Oh, Sophie exclaimed. His language is jumbled. He just babbles. Rimbib's maid share a toyful show, the giant said in a reflective tone. Okay, I accept there's a giant in front of me, Cal announced, expecting that was what he needed to do to get down. It's more than that, Sophie corrected. There are 3 types: knowledge, strength, and passion. They are all ways the community took power and abused it. He's a symbol of knowledge. Sophie then threw her hands in front of her. It's not easy. Societal sins run in the background and become norms. We participate in them because to do otherwise means we're punished by the community, like standing up for the Jews during the Holocaust. That's why they're all so big. Cal could wrap his head around misused power. I get that. What giant is the Holocaust? Sophie shook her head. Because you can relate to those who let it happen, she probed. No, Cal disagreed. I just get that it's wrong. Let's look at another giant. This one's not yours. Looking up, she waved. Bye, Nimrod. It was nice seeing you again. Lassie, little noodle diet him mount, he yip build, he replied. Sophie nodded. Sorry, she yelled up. To Cal, she added, he had said hi. I was supposed to tell you that. He also just said bye. You did understand him, Cal exclaimed. Sophie nodded. You could too if you accepted that as your societal sin. Yelling up to Nimrod, he waved, bye. Nimrod waved back. That he understood. As they walked, Cal pondered. So how does knowledge lead to his jumbled speech? Not stopping, Sophie answered. Knowledge without relationship. As humans, we do it all the time. What we don't realize is, as we learn all these new thoughts and ideas, it washes out our ability to speak to one another. That was the communal sin Nimrod held. As they were walking towards another giant. Now they were close enough to see her, and she was hideous. Cal found himself taking a step back in spite of himself, but Sophie was prepared, grabbed his arm as his foot landed in nothingness. Cal gathered his balance. Thanks. Who is she? Strength. Power through vanity and what one can see. They build on that and abuse it, not realizing how ugly it makes them all on the inside. How is that a communal sin? Cal once again wondered out loud. Even though most of us are not in the popular, pretty group, we all play along. That's what makes it a communal sin. Now Cal understood. As he remembered his prom, he chose to pretend to go with a girl while he was really going with Keith. It was the expectations of the popular crowd that made him do it. In recalling prom, he could see how he played into that popular sin. If I said I was going to prom with Keith, they would have told me I couldn't, and then the rest of my senior year they would have made fun of us. That's why we pretended to go with girls. He couldn't remember if he had told Sophie about prom, but she seemed to understand either way. That's part of it, Sophie replied. Communal sin is also huge because it punishes those who try to break it. Therefore, those who eventually break communal sin never do so because they are being selfish. They do it for the sake of others. Think of those sit-ins in the 60s. It was the people who first sat in the restaurants who were punished. It was the people who followed them who gained the reward. She looked down. Many of those who gain from communal sin can't see the problem because they're gaining something from it. Many of those who are hurt from communal sin don't want to stop it for fear they will lose what little they have. You wanted to be left alone, so you played along. Now the giant looked absolutely terrifying. He knew he could ride this one, and why. Then he quickly shook his head. Not this one. That's okay, Sophie murmured soothingly. You're not ready yet, she said just as soothingly, but her face was slightly alarmed as she shot a glance to the watch on his wrist. How long had they spent on the last bridge? Maybe 20 minutes? He had no idea. It felt like 20 minutes. It could have been 40 for all he knew. Then, what was the horn? Was that the call for whatever would take them out of hell? He took a very ragged breath, prepared to face this sin. They didn't have time for him to be choosy. He was just about to tell her he'd face this one when Sophie put a hand on his chest. When he looked at her, she shook her head. Not this one. Scowling, he looked down at his watch, which read, "The time isn't now." Then he sighed. This wasn't the one after all. With a small sense of relief, he nodded to Sophie, and the two continued. This they did in silence for at least a dozen agonizing minutes as they hoped one of the masses in the darkness would see them and offer them passage. When they finally saw one, it took a good 4 or 5 minutes for it to come close. It made Cal very aware of time. He finally understood Sophie's anxiety at the beginning of the journey, because he was feeling it now. Everything was moving slower and slower. When the giant moved close enough to see, it was the most terrifying of all the giants. "No," he blurted. This giant wasn't hideous. He had a good idea it wouldn't speak in jumbled words. This giant looked exactly like Keith. "What is it?" Sophie asked. It's my ex-boyfriend," he said, almost inaudible. "He symbolizes the community sin of passion," Sophie responded. "But I promise you this giant is not your ex." Cal just numbly nodded. "Is God telling me it was wrong for me to love him?" He stared at giant Keith ambling toward them. "That's not the point of this," Sophie responded. "This is about the passions of the community causing us to not see the humanity beyond the carnal desires. This sin means you see what you want because what you want is carnal. You can't see his humanity." She quickly breathed in through her nose and slowly breathed out through her mouth. "What's wrong?" Cal asked. "I don't think this giant means the same thing for you as it does for me," she confessed. "What do you see?" Cal asked. "Lucy." She first shook her head before she closed her eyes and nodded it. "This is our giant." A look of terror filled her face. It was a look Cal had never seen on her before. "Why are you seeing Lucy?" Cal asked, wondering what community sin the ruler of hell represented. "Remember when I told you were working my cracks?" "Yeah," Cal said almost as a question. "Well, I realized then that I'm being put through the system again. God is getting me ready for heaven. It is a communal sin of strength to willfully avoid God, to try to keep what we have. I don't want to go to heaven. I want to see my boys first." She bit her bottom lip and looked up at the giant. "I need to accept that God has a plan." Cal looked up at the giant face of Keith looking calmly down to him. If his dad had just sold the shop, if his grandfather had just moved on, but no, he had to face something he wasn't allowed to have, not because Keith hadn't loved him. He had loved him plenty, but because of choices that were beyond his control. "I've been obsessed with that stupid shop for so long," he began to explain. "And not because I wanted to be obsessed. I was possessed by my grandpa's obsession. If that hadn't happened, I never would have let him go." Sophie, who had been staring at the giant, looked at Cal and placed her hand on his, which he realized when she did this, he had been pointing at her. Love isn't about keeping or losing. She closed her eyes a second and bowed her head. Piercing her lips, she looked back up. Love is about seeking the best for a community or person. He didn't want to hear what she was saying. He wanted to hear that overcoming something that had been unfairly put on him wouldn't permanently keep him from what he lost. Then again, what about Sophie? Was their different sin really the same in that way? It's not fair, he said for both of them. It's not fair, she agreed. Community sin always has winners and losers. And the many of the winners don't even know what they're doing because everything is going great for them. It's also bad because the ones who realize what they're part of often don't want to quit because they don't want to be punished for doing what is right. Meanwhile, no one on any side can really bring back what was lost. For that reason, community sin is more difficult to break than personal sin. Cal fell to his knees. I was fine before. I wasn't thinking about my past or what could have been my future. He grabbed his head and let it drop. Sophie dropped down beside him. She whispered, Cal, there isn't one true love. That's this passion. You have to let that idea go. And let Keith go, he mumbled. And let her son go, he thought. This was horrible. Why were they forced to work through this right now? There was silence. Then she said softer than anything he had ever heard her say. You no longer have him to let go of. He looked at her, as her realization was clearly for them both. Love's not someone you keep. It's a relationship you build, she finished. Then they hugged and cried, yet again, each for one another's loss. Eventually, he nodded and pulled back. Relationship, not ownership. He wiped his face with the palms of his hands. This is the one. Up to this point, he hadn't even considered the possibility the giant could have wandered away while they were working through their problems. Instead, it was looking at them. It was in seeing his continued presence, he realized the giant had intentionally found them. He closed his eyes and nodded. You're not mine. You never were. And I didn't build our relationship, so that's not mine either. When he opened his eyes, the giant hand was there for them to step on. He looked to Sophie, who was still staring up at the giant. I must let my children make their own choices. Because they are both their own men, I might have to move on for their sake. A huge smile spread across Giant Keith, and he nodded. Sophie held her hand out. Cal took it, and both stepped on the giant's hand. The giant, in turn, cupped his other hand over the two, protecting them as he began to lean down. This was not the smooth descent of Garon. This was nearly a free fall, and Cal found himself hugging a finger with his free arm for some kind of stability. But the stop was gentle. Cal hadn't realized it had happened when the hands opened up and deposited them on the ground. There were no goodbyes or thank you. It was like the giant had never been there. In its place was a frozen wasteland. It felt like they had been deposited into a walk-in freezer. There was no snow. Instead, they were standing on frozen mud. The liquid within the dirt crystallized to create an uneven walking surface, even worse than if it had been stones. In fact, in front of them, it was what looked like a frozen lake with something huge jutting out of the center. Cal shivered. "Shall we?" he asked Sophie. Sophie nodded, and the two began their walk towards the center of the lake, the very center of hell.